All right, guys. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Results Loading Podcast hosted by Prosperous AI. I'm your host, Michael Atkin, and today we have a fantastic guest joining us. Someone who has truly done it all in the world of supply chain, with over 20 years of experience across public sector procurement, aviation, defense, manufacturing, energy industries. He is not only a master of contract negotiation and strategic sourcing, but also an expert in logistics, third-party risk management, as well as project management. I'm thrilled to welcome Patrick Carr, government contracts expert at Procurement Contract Solutions. Patrick, welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Michael. I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to share my story.
Yeah, absolutely, man. We're looking forward to hearing it ourselves here. So with that being said, Patrick, let's take it back to the very beginning. What initially sparked your interest in supply chain management? Was it something you stumbled into? How did we really get here? Take us back to the beginning and break it down for us.
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question. I am old enough to have started out where supply chain wasn't actually a profession. So it kind of was meshed into industrial engineering, operations management, and then you had the procurement and warehousing side of it. So I went to Texas Tech University, was a marketing major. Didn't really like my options coming out of school, so I kind of followed in the footsteps of a lot of the men in my family. I joined the Air Force. So I joined as an Air Force officer. And in the Air Force, unlike a lot of the other branches, you kind of have your job set. You just happen to be an Air Force officer. So I ended up in acquisitions and contract management. For the Air Force, I did that for 6.5 years, negotiated with some of the biggest companies out there, your Boeings, your Northrop Grumman, some of these massive companies. Did that, like I said, did that for 6.5 years, deployed to the Middle East, had an interesting career and experience there, but realized it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do. So getting out of that was a really good career field to have to get out of the military. And so I was able to segue that into the defense industry, and being a procurement and acquisitions guy, that kind of led me into the supply chain world, in the defense industry. So primary focus has been on purchasing, procurement, and contract management, but that is obviously one piece of supply chain management. And throughout the rest of my career, I've kind of added on the inventory management, the production planning, the warehousing, the things that come with supply chain management. But it definitely was something that kind of picked me. I didn't necessarily pick it, and it's been quite a ride.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And obviously having the military background really sets you up in terms of what you don't necessarily see on paper. And we'll get into this later, but in terms of the leadership and the discipline aspects and how you conduct yourself as a professional. We've had a few Air Force guys here on the podcast, and there's definitely a common denominator there in terms of those elements of, like I said, the discipline, the mentorship, the leadership aspects, which I'm looking forward to hearing about from you here as well. Before we get into that, Pat, on the flip side, can you tell us about one of your first big wins or aha moments? Obviously, you've had an illustrious career thus far, had decision maker leadership positions across different companies. But can you talk about when you initially started to realize, and this may have been back at the Air Force, I don't know. I'll obviously defer to you, but when did you really start to realize, hey, I'm pretty god darn good at this? Like, what did you learn from that experience, and how has that kind of stuck with you to this day at this point?
That's I think for me, it was when I had a friend ask me to help him buy a car. So he didn't want to go, didn't like the face-to-face, the back and forth with the sales guy. He's like, hey, you're a buyer, you negotiate this stuff. Come with me, help me buy a car. And it ended up being, honestly, it was a lot of fun. It was just a lot of people don't like the back and forth, and I mean, in all fairness, procurement and buying in the corporate world, in the defense industry, nothing like buying a car, right? But it was the back and forth, it was the negotiation, it was the ability to kind of counter some arguments that typical sales guy is going to present. And for me, that was kind of the moment where I was like, okay, I'm pretty good at this. And was one of those things where it's not necessarily been for me a career that I've always loved, but have gotten pretty good at it. And I take that and leverage that now to help other companies do that.
In contract negotiation is a big part of your expertise. And I know I can imagine it's probably not fun 100% of the time. Obviously, car salesmen are probably, have no chance against someone like you and your background. But what has been one of the most challenging negotiations that you've been part of that you can speak to, of course? And how did you handle it?
Yeah, sure. Honestly, some of the hardest stuff in my career is when you're negotiating with, so when I was in the oil and gas industry, I was negotiating with a European-based provider of oil and gas equipment. And they had very hard and fast rules around certain things they're going to allow, indemnification and the warranty parts and things like that. And that got to be really tricky. One of the terms they were asking for was 100% guarantee that no water would enter into their equipment. I don't know if you're familiar with the oil and gas industry, but no matter how dry you get natural gas, there's still some form of water vapor in that gas. And you can't guarantee that. It wasn't something I was willing to sign up for. And we ended up having to change our specs and go with a different supplier because they were just unwilling to budge off of that. And sometimes you have to be able to be willing to do that. Luckily, we had that luxury where we had some options to do that. You don't always have that option. So then it becomes a risk management decision. For me, in that particular scenario, if we hadn't had an option, I would have taken it to my management, said, here's the risk. But we were able to actually get to a more reasonable supplier and come up with a better solution there. But that one was pretty tricky. Been in all kinds of negotiations with, like I said, with multiple organizations. Sometimes from being a smaller company, working with a larger company, the larger companies like to kind of flex their weight around and try to get you to sign up to things. And part of what I try to do, especially now advising clients, is saying, hey, you don't have to sign up to it just because they want you to, and empowering them to be able to push back on that. You're coming to me as a small business for a reason, right? Or I'm selling something to you for a reason. Let's come to common ground.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And kind of back to your point, I mean, when customers and partners are requesting 100% guarantee, it's like a pretty heavy ask, right? I mean, how are we supposed to navigate? And you obviously speak to this as well as anybody, I'm sure, but when you get requests like that and they want 100% guarantee, that's not like asking, for something tangible that is 100% can be, decided or determined, like water going into the oil. I mean, how do you manage those situations, especially when it's not something that's really within anybody's control and an argument could be made for or against a situation like that? I mean, how do you get to a common ground, especially with a large situation like that?
Yeah, and I think it's important to know kind of what your walkaway point is, kind of what's your line in the sand. And I've prided myself on always trying to be able to reach a mutually agreeable solution. If I can give something that's maybe less important to me, but might be more important to you, trying to figure that out, that's kind of where I try to go with that. And having a walkaway point. And if you, like I mentioned, if you don't have an alternative solution, let's say you're buying for an aircraft and that's the part you have to have, and they're the only part maker that's doing it, you have to be able to quantify that risk. And so part of my job was presenting the risk to the decision makers, to ultimately to the executives, and trying to quantify that and mitigate that as best as possible, either through some other kind of negotiation or some other kind of clause that might help offset that, and just being able to stick to your guns too. And some things are not worth risking the business over. And just because they have something you want, maybe there's a better way to do it. Maybe you can reverse engineer it. Maybe you can 3D print it. Maybe you can find another provider that's almost as good. Maybe you can find something that's maybe not exactly what you wanted, but close enough, and be able to then kind of understand what your options are going. And you can't figure that on the fly. You got to know that going in, kind of what is the position of the supplier that I'm negotiating with, and maybe that's why I like the car side so much, because there's so many options out there. And I mean, if I don't buy your car, okay, great, I'll go buy the next one. And that's there's much more pressure on the sales guy there.
Right.
Corporate
He
world,
needs you. He needs you a lot more than you need him, and you can
in
leverage
that case, that's for sure, right? The corporate world's obviously not always like that. Very rarely is there a you have to use me kind of scenario. You see it more so on the government side, where there's specific applications, there's specific contractors they want you to use, but more often it's specific requirements that have to be met, not necessarily. Like one of the companies I was at, we had a software package that was designed specifically to interface with a Boeing airframe. Well, we were a named contractor. Boeing had to work with us. So they tried to play hardball, but we ultimately were able to say, you've got to get on contract with us. These are our terms, except take them or leave. And so it works both ways, right? Even as a small business, we had that opportunity to leverage, kind of reverse leverage that. But having a good exit strategy and knowing what your walkway point is, that you've got to have that figured out going into any negotiation, whether it's a house, car, corporate, whatever it is. Then it's not always easy.
Absolutely. So it sounds like strategic planning, leverage point, and walkaway point are probably the top three things that you need to have going into those kinds of conversations, unreasonable or not. Whether there's a contract in place, there's legal language protecting both sides. Those are non-negotiables, and those are things that you're going to have to lean on in order to get anywhere, especially when we're talking billion-dollar contracts or government contracts and everything in between, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I always try to take the approach when I was at one of the largest energy companies in the world. We had pretty strict indemnity and indemnification language around our equipment, but I always try to take a little bit of a rational approach. Is, if I'm dealing with a janitorial company, are they are they going to have that kind of liability protection? Number two, and what's the risk to the enterprise? Now, a construction company coming in and doing hot work on a facility, okay, yeah, absolutely. We're going to make sure that if they screw something up, they're going to be held accountable for it. Same thing with us. But so that helped me kind of come up with my walkway points. Even though we didn't like to negotiate indemnity or the insurance requirements, I was able to effectively make that argument within the corporate world based on the risk that we were trying to mitigate. So understanding the risks associated with that particular effort. When you're buying in the aviation world, is this part going on an airplane, and does it have to be certified by the FAA? There's certain things that go into that requirement. So as long as you understand a good understanding of risk, I would also add to your list.
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. And understanding the risk. And then it's obviously your job to go and translate what the risk is to, your superiors or the executive team, and allow them to make the best possible decision on moving forward, of course, which kind of lands on you're the liaison.
And even from the corporate world, understanding risk in your supply chain whether it may not necessarily be risk of someone coming in and damaging your facility or something like that, but it could be, what's the reputation of this trucking company? Is my product going to get lost? How am I mitigating that? What are my freight terms that I've applied to that product going out the door? Who's responsible for it? What's the risk in my supply chain? Is all my manufacturing in Taiwan or China? What's the geopolitical risks there? Am I heavily commodity exposed? Is my raw material an index price, or is it a must-have? So understanding all of the complexities into that. I'm importing things from overseas. Now, was I prepared for a strike that could have happened on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, right? Got through it on the West Coast, now on the East Coast and the Gulf. Hey, sounds like we dodged that bullet, right? But was I prepared for that? Was I bringing in more? A risk is Chinese New Year, right? So if you manufacture in China, China doesn't build your thing for 3 weeks, and then it takes another week and a half to 2 to ramp up. Do you have 6 weeks worth of material in your pipeline? Are you covered to bridge that gap? So it's understanding your holistic risk, not just one-time risk to a facility, one-time risk to a transaction.
Absolutely. You know, the Chinese New Year example is actually genius just because a lot of times people don't take some of this stuff into account. You know, same thing with weather, for example, in like the northeast coast. It's like if stuff's coming out of, you know, that region, how is the weather going to influence or impact shipping times or whatnot? But yeah, I used to deal with that on the sales side all the time. Chinese New Year, I have customers calling saying, "Where's my stuff?" It's like, it's coming from China. I don't know if you knew this. They haven't worked in 3 weeks. It's Chinese New Year.
Right.
So are we, you know, and obviously that lands on your plate, and it's a really significant aspect of managing the supply chain and the conversations with your end users, customers, and partners, because all of these things need to be taken into account. And not everyone thinks of this all the time. That's why we have people like Patrick Carr here to keep everyone in line, I guess.
Yeah, no, that I appreciate that. And when my most recent role as director of supply chain at a manufacturer here in Oklahoma City, we bought a lot of steel from one of the largest steel pole providers on the planet. Well, they also happen to they'd be working with Verizon on their 5G updates. So understanding your relative buying position also within that market. You know, I'm buying 10 poles from them. Well, okay. I know yeah, they're committed to get them to me, but yeah, if they need one for a bigger job, am I going to be delayed? What's that impact on my customers? So just making sure that I'm in good communication throughout that whole channel. Same thing with our Chinese distributors, right? If they're, hey, are we planning in, you know, by October, November? If I haven't put in my Chinese New Year's orders, I'm behind the curve. So making sure that we have good communication and an understanding of the inherent risk in your supply chain, any supply chain manager should be able to mitigate that.
Absolutely, Pat. And shifting gears here, you've worked extensively, as we can probably tell by the last 15, 20 minutes of chatting, in public sector, procurement, and defense. How does managing supply chain in these industries, obviously public sector and defense, differ from the private sector? What do you prefer? What is the main differences and advantages to one or the other, if at all?
Yeah, for sure. No, so public sector and defense industry, very heavily regulated, right? There's an acquisition regulation that's thousands of pages long that you have to understand that basically the government telling you how to do business, who you can do business with, how you're going to provide it, what you are agreeing to when you do business with, both as a federal government buyer and as someone working in the defense industry. You have to understand what those requirements are. For example, Buy America Act is a big deal. Certain things you can only buy from the United States or its allies by law. Right. One of those is titanium. Well, the problem is the United States doesn't smelt titanium. So, but I have to buy titanium from, or at least they didn't. I'm sure that industry is some of your listeners may be going, I'm in the titanium industry now. The bulk of the world's titanium was smelted out of Russia, China, and luckily Canada and Australia. So I could buy it from Canada and Australia. But so just those kind of things you have to be aware of. When you're dealing with public dollars, as there should be, there's some pretty tight oversight over that. Right? You have how you interact with the federal government. They can come in and look at your books at any point in time. You have to make sure as you're pricing that out and as you're managing your supply chain, you're not mixing what are corporate expenses versus what is going to the government. Making sure those are clearly defined. You have rules around what you can pay your employees, what kind of benefits you can leverage back to the government, what kind of some limitations on your bonuses and things like that, that are much different in the commercial side. And the commercial side is kind of, you have the UCC, right, Uniform Commercial Code, but pretty much wild west, right? If you want to go to I say wild west, it's not unregulated and ungoverned. It's just a lot more flexible.
Yeah.
If when I'm working in the manufacturing sector, I didn't have any specific requirements about how many outside of your normal procurement policies. If I like a company and I like their offering, I can go direct to them with no real justification to do so.
Right.
I don't have to get multiple bids and buys. Now, I still have an obligation to my management and my shareholders to make sure I'm doing a cost-effective procurement and the best value for the company. But there's a lot more flexibility on that. I can get a new technology that I like, and I can implement it with really very little oversight or management until I start dealing in with the government dollar space. On the flip side of that, commercial companies that don't often deal with the government get a little nervous when it comes to regulated purchases. This manufacturer out in Oklahoma City, we had some Department of Transportation projects. Our customers, who we were supplying material to, are the construction companies. For lack of a better way to put it, kind of freaked out when it came to federal government dollars, and they got nervous around all the requirements with it. Someone like me then can help them navigate that and say, okay, yeah, you don't have to worry about that. No, hey, we got to do this. A lot of our material came from China, came from overseas. We just had to be more aware as a company. Hey, we have to manage our supply chain in such a way that we meet those requirements. As far as which I prefer, I'm pretty comfortable in either one. I honestly might prefer the government side a little bit better because I know the rules. I know what I'm playing as long as I can follow that checklist and meet them. The commercial world's almost a little bit overwhelming. I mean, very, very rarely in the defense industry did I have someone come to me and say, hey, I talked to these guys, this engineering company. They might have taken me hunting, I don't know, but and they've got this really cool thing, and let's go out and buy it. And I got that all the time in the commercial industry. There might be a cool technology that someone in the defense industry is pitching, but there's still a thorough, rigorous process that they have to go through. I saw it more when I was an Air Force officer. I saw it some where guys would come in and want us to buy from a specific company, but generally speaking, most of them understood the rules. That just doesn't that didn't happen like that way in the commercial world for sure.
It's an interesting point you bring up, preferring the public sector just because it's so airtight and a little less of that wild west element that you mentioned that you see more on the commercial side. Because in public sector, it's like, hey, I know all the rules. I know exactly how this needs to be buttoned up correctly. And it's like almost preferable. Yeah, maybe I may or may not have gone hunting on someone else's dime in the commercial space, which was really great. But then you're dealing with, the wild west elements that come with playing in that space. I had a situation where my background is predominantly in the public sector in the EDU space. And I was working opportunity with an educational institution, a lot of money, higher ed institution. And I sent them a quote for, a few units, just getting things going. And they said, okay, no problem. We need to, get board meeting set and board meeting approval. And it was only like $10K. We were just getting started. It's like, you need a board meeting for $10,000. And it's like, you know what? That really sums up sometimes in a way how it is. Because obviously in the public sector, it's the public's money. They need to make sure every penny is accounted for. And I wasn't surprised. It hurts my sales cycle because I'm trying to keep things moving. Where incorporated, they're like, who cares? We'll write you a check, wire you the money, whatever, no problem. And so it's an interesting take on your part, just saying, hey, public sector, everything's so buttoned up and I'm so in line and in tune with the rules that I almost preferred because I know exactly what to expect and exactly how things are going to go down,
Yeah, for sure. And I felt that obviously I was a warranty contracting officer, so I was legally authorized to spend taxpayer dollars. And that's a big responsibility. And in the way the federal government works, we were the only ones allowed to spend taxpayer dollars, not a a cabinet secretary level position, the general officer. Nobody legally could make that obligation, but someone like me. So obviously, hey, my name's on the line, so I have to understand the rules. But it's a responsibility in the corporate world. I feel like everybody has the authority, has the implied authority, at least within the company. Now the director of engineering goes out, or the CFO, or it was a little less buttoned up. Now, obviously, some companies have more robust procurement policies and plans in place that spell those out. But generally speaking, I found in the corporate world, far more spend is unmanaged than is managed. That's generally the opposite in the public sector.
Totally, because you're dealing with private dollars and it's less of a big deal. They don't have to answer to the public a few times a year in terms of where the money's going.
Yeah, and very rarely had to answer to me.
Right.
The dollar.
Absolutely. Well, Pat, switching gears a little bit into more of the leadership side and some of the leadership positions and decision-making positions that you've held in the past. As you know, you've held various leadership positions across various organizations. When it comes to building a cohesive team in a complex and often stressful environment, how are we going in and executing that team building, that team creation? What are you looking for? And how are you making sure that, the team you build is going to be successful and in line with not only the company values, but your values as well?
No, that's a great question. I think personnel management's one of the most challenging parts of being in business. It's also one of the most rewarding. And for me, I like to start off with understanding your functional knowledge. Are you knowledgeable in what I've hired you to do, or what you've been doing? Let's say I come in and take over a team. Are you knowledgeable in what's your strengths, what your weaknesses, understanding the individuals, and are they in the right seat for what we're asking them to do? For me, my leadership approach is especially outside of the military, was, hey, you're a professional. I'm paying you to be a professional. Do your job, do it well, keep me informed, and let me get out of your way. We run into roadblocks. I'll be happy to take those, work those as best I can, but you got to tell me. I've been in organizations where that style hasn't always worked. I've had managers, leaders above me that have expected me to know everything about everything, and that's just not really my style, right? I'm not. If I have a buyer or a supervisor that's out doing the purchasing work or the transportation work or whatever it is, the planning work, I'm trusting them to get it done and inform me kind of big picture. When you have a disconnect in the corporate values or the leadership above you, then it wasn't a very sustainable situation for me. And as far as my values, that's one of the biggest things I look for when I take on a client or a new opportunity. Does the corporate values align with my personal values? A little hard to tell when you're coming in. I've never sat in an interview once and someone said, "Hey, I micromanage the crap out of you," but yet you
find out later, but they're not going to tell you before you make that decision, of course.
That's right. 120 days, you're past your 90-day probationary period. You're in the 120, 180 days. All of a sudden, they're like, "Hey, why aren't you doing this? Why didn't you do it this way? Why didn't you?" So I have always taken the approach with my teams that have worked for me is, I expect you to be a professional. I don't have all the answers. I don't always have the best practices. I've seen a lot. That doesn't necessarily mean it works for you or for the company. And as long as you make a decision and it's with the best intent. And I've never also been a no mistake kind of guy, right? Everybody's going to make mistakes. We're all humans. Some mistakes obviously have different consequences, but what was the intent of that action going in? Did you fumble a or a contract negotiation with a supplier? Okay, we'll live with that, right? Yeah, maybe it's going to cost us some more, or did you completely botch something and it cost us millions of dollars in customers? Okay, well, now we may have to reevaluate that. still learn from it. It may cost you more, but making sure that everybody's learning from it. And if there were if gaps in the skill sets, hey, get them trained, right? Either one-on-one mentoring, send them to class. There's a ton of great classes out there, both the online LMS options, LinkedIn Learning, Coursera, all these great opportunities, but also organizations within the supply chain world that have tons of great training out there. So you have to have a trained workforce. And frankly, that's, I think, kind of a gap in the corporate world. And I use that both public sector and private sector, right? There's just a gap. Everybody has so much on their plate. We don't have time to send somebody to a 2-week class. That was one thing I did appreciate about the Air Force is when I came in, I knew I was going to be an acquisitions officer. They made sure I went to training. I went to before I could even touch my first contract. I know you got to go to this school and this school and this school and this school. And yeah, there was some hands-on learning, sit down with the individuals, but that's stuck with me, is making sure that individuals, are they trained to do their job? Just because someone's a really good, it's the Air Force, right? Just because you're a really good pilot isn't going to make you a really good manager, right? Just because you could be the best machine operator in the history of machine operators, that doesn't mean you're going to be a good people leader, right? You could be the best engineer, and that doesn't mean you can go, run a P&L. You just make sure that we're equipping the people with the right skill set to do it, and identify them. Have a serious conversation. It's like, hey, engineer, we're going to put you in charge of this P&L. What do you understand about, the balance sheet? What do you understand about corporate finance? What, you can't just be good at drawing things and designing specs. You gotta understand these other nuances behind it too. So I think that's my keys.
Yeah, absolutely. And identifying, where the skill set lies within each individual, right? Because you made a great point. I mean, just because could be the best pilot, best engineer in the world, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be great leaders. And maybe they just want to sit there and put their head down and be an engineer or be a pilot. And that doesn't necessarily mean they want to be promotion. It required their leaders to really determine, hey, who's going to be good at leading and who's going to be good at just the hands-on stuff. There's no right or wrong. One isn't better or worse than the other. It's just identifying where the potential is. Maybe your 4th or 5th best engineer could be the number 1 best leader and great motivator and absolutely optimize the productivity and efficiency if in a different role. Who knows? It's up to the people in charge to really identify those situations and put people in positions to be successful where their skill sets lie. Right. That's a theme I've actually heard from a lot of people here on the podcast too. Identifying and understanding people. It sounds a little cliche and really simple, but obviously one of the more important elements of being a good leader in a position such as yourself.
And I think a key to that is be open-minded, right? If you're a pilot, I go back to the Air Force, right? Just because you're a pilot doesn't necessarily that gives you all the skill set, right? There are other good leaders outside of the pilot community. There's other in oil and gas companies, right? If you're an engineer, they're gonna promote you. So there's other good leaders outside of engineering. Just because you don't have that engineering degree doesn't mean you can't effectively be a business unit leader for an energy company, right? So and in some cases you might be a better one. I sat next to pilots every day that all they want to do was fly planes. And the ironic thing is, the better they got at flying planes, the more likely they would get to pulled out of that plane. So no wonder they all go fly airlines, right? Because all they want to do is fly planes. Same thing with engineers. I know a bunch of engineers that all they want to do is design stuff. But the better they got at designing stuff, the more likely they were going to get put in charge of stuff. And not everybody's cut out to lead people. Not everybody wants to lead people. And not everybody should lead people. So I think that's where you end up losing really good employees.
Yeah, well, obviously, people don't quit because of the job. A lot of times people quit because of the management and who they're dealing with on the day to day. So yeah, you put an engineer who all he wants to do is design in a leadership role and people can't stand the guy or gal. It's like, well, that kind of ruined everything for not just that person. It ruined everything, network kind of around him that surrounded him. And we lost 4 or 5 good employees because we made a bad leadership call. for example?
I worked for a boss once who was an engineer by training in the supply chain field. So we put him in commanded supply chain, and every Monday he'd come in. Boy, sure would have been a good weekend to get caught up on stuff. Okay, that's not how I operated, and that's not. I mean, he just was the kind of guy that was, he just happened to be an engineer, but he was also a workaholic, right? An 80-hour, 100 hours a week kind of guy. Okay, that's not a style that I responded well to. That's not. I don't think that was the expectations of the company. Did the company benefit from it? Probably, but to your point, we lost 4 or 5 really good people because of that. And nobody wanted to say, hey, yeah, I'll see you Saturday morning. I'll see you Sunday morning. Right. That's just not how we were wired. And that's how he was. And yeah, frankly, it was not a good situation.
Yeah, no, it's a tale as old as time. And unfortunate at that. But Pat, real quick, I want to dive a little bit deeper, if you will. Can you speak a little bit more? And you touched on a lot of good stuff just now, but can you speak a little bit more to the impact that starting your career off in the military had on your leadership role, and in terms of identifying how you determine what your people are good at? One of my favorite examples, and one of my previous guests on the podcast, his whole thing was, if there's anything bothering you whatsoever, come and talk to me. Like, just be transparent with me. So he had a guy come in, he'd worked for him for a few years, and the guy was okay at his job. And he said, hey, I don't really like what I'm doing. I'd like to do something else. And so together they collaborated, and my guest on the podcast got this employee into a different role that he thought he was better suited for. And now he's running the entire organization. He's been there for 20 years. And so he says often the employee will stop by his office, because he's still at the same company, and say, hey, that conversation you and I had was the most important conversation of my entire career. Just because he created an environment that allowed for employees to come in and say, you know what, man, this isn't working for me. Like, can you help me figure out what I need to do? So with that all being said, Pat, and I want to tie this back in the military because I think it's relevant. What is some of the most impactful elements of that experience in terms of you being a great leader and the success that, because of you and the way you are, you allow your team to be successful simultaneously with you?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think the military is a great place to learn leadership and a terrible place to learn leadership. And by that, I mean that as a military leader, I had certain sticks that I could use to motivate my employees, especially my enlisted employees, my enlisted team that was below me. Hey, you don't do what I say, there's some pretty dangerous consequences there.
Yeah.
But it also, and it's a much more directive culture. Hey, I tell you to do it, you go do it. And so learning, I think it taught me 2 things. One, how not to lead, and in the corporate world, and then it taught me kind of how to advocate for myself, because the military is the Air Force that I was in, and I've been out for a long time, so I can't speak to the current climate in it, but when the Air Force I was in, we were expected to advocate for our careers. And so to your point about the individual coming in and asking for something different, advocate for assignment, advocate for school slots, advocate for different opportunities that are out there. And so I've always tried to empower my employees to do that, even if the corporate culture didn't support that. I've been in some organizations where, nope, that's the slot you're in. And again, like I mentioned earlier, getting the right people in the right seats on the bus, so to speak. You hear that a lot. I hear that all the time from leaders to say, oh, we just want to make sure we get the right people in the right slot. And more times than not, they don't really mean it. They mean that if you're not in the right seat, you leave the company. And again, there's not always an opportunity, right? But at the same time, if you're a valued employee and you're just not thriving in what you're doing, that's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because if you're not thriving, are you at risk of being let go? Or are you just bored and unmotivated? Is there something going on in your personal life? Hey, and let's get you in a different role. Back to what we said about the engineer, right? You got an engineer who's now leading a department. and hates it, right? Does he want to go be a senior SME engineer and make a good living and not supervise people at all? Great, let's put him back in that role, right? Or does he want to go now? All of a sudden, does he want to go be head of maintenance, right? And he, because he likes to tinker with things and he knows exactly what needs to happen on that machine. Great, put him in charge of that. So helping people advocate for their careers is a big part of what I've tried to do. And I have learned a lot of the military approach doesn't translate very well, especially to companies or industries that are not really military adjacent. A lot of high type A driven kind of personalities tend to be in that type of industry. Even those guys don't often respond to directive leadership unless it's a safety type decision, right? But if it's hey, I want you to go run this financial model for me because I need you to run it for me. How you approach that kind of depends, and generational too, right? The generations respond differently to different styles. I'm glad I'm not in the military right now. As much as I love working with younger guys, younger folks, there's just a different style and a different approach that I don't think that a lot of the military approach to leadership would these guys would respond very well to.
They wouldn't translate well into where you're at now. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you have to know that. And for me, I like to think I'm a good leader. You'd have to ask the people that I've led whether I am or not. But there's been times when my leadership style hasn't meshed with what the corporation thinks is a good leader, right? The corporation might have wanted a more directive, a more hard ass kind of approach, and that's not really. As I've gotten older and been in more management positions, I found that doesn't really work for me very often. Do I have I had opportunities I'd like to have back? Sure, of course. And have I had situations where maybe I took in a more directive approach than I should have, and it didn't go well? Yeah, of course. But that's how you learn, and that's kind of what I hope to keep building on in the future.
Absolutely. No, it's a great response. And I should have prefaced with whether it be for the better or worse, but I'm glad that you were able to make clear sometimes some of the militaristic traits in terms of leadership don't actually translate that well into the corporate world, for example. And I think that's important to hear as well. Sure, maybe it made you into the guy that you are and the great leader that you are, but doesn't necessarily translate well to everybody, especially who didn't come from that environment, for example.
Sure. And I think the best and worst thing for me coming, and I joke with people all the time, I wasn't in the military, I was in the Air Force, right? So we're very corporate oriented. And I worked here in Oklahoma City for a very large acquisition base. There's 30,000 employees there. Most of them are civilians, government civilians. So working with government civilians is a completely different management approach than it is with the military guys. And when I was overseas and deployed in the Middle East, yeah, that approach had to be a little different than when I'm here negotiating with Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and these massive companies, right? And working with civilians who are going to be there after my 3-year tour is done, and interacting with those individuals. I've learned how to adapt my style, and I think that's one of my strongest suits is adapting my approach, whether you're the janitor or bus driver, whether you're the president or the CEO, whether you're a military guy, whether you've got no background in the military whatsoever, whether you can't stand military guys or whatever. I feel like one of the things I'm really strong at is tailoring that approach and trying to empathize, at least on the business side, with the individuals. Personal empathy sometimes might be a little bit lacking, but
sure.
But the business side of it, I definitely tried to figure out where you're coming from, and maybe that's the negotiator in me, is to kind of come up with your approach and come up with a mutual agreeable approach or solution.
Fantastic, Pat. And one last thing before we wrap up here. If you had a crystal ball other than maybe getting us next week's lottery numbers, for example, which would be fantastic.
Right.
What's one prediction you'd make about the future of supply chain, say, 5-10 years from now? Where do we see it headed? Maybe, give us your thoughts on the influence that technology will have on the future of supply chain and how it's managed. Kind of help us wrap up here in terms of where you see us going and moving forward at this point.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's a great question. And I will preface this with saying I am not a huge fan of AI, but AI is going to be everywhere, and AI is going to drive data analytics and analytical decisions. And I think how we use it is more important than what it can do, because you can use it for nefarious purposes, or you can use it for beneficial purposes. But I think from a supply chain analytics, AI is going to be huge in that perspective. I think that you're going to see in the short term a little bit of more retrenching from the global economy, trying to bring in more homegrown type economies and enterprises while still participating in the global world. I think you're going to see a heightened awareness of the global interaction when it comes to weather events. But technology wise, I think like for me, from a contracts review perspective, there are tools out there now that I can use to review a contract in a matter of seconds and identify the risk. I identify the risk associated with that contract in a matter of seconds. And whereas similarly, I pride myself on being able to read a contract and interpret it. How many more can I get done? How many more clients can I serve if I'm using the AI tools out there? How much of a supply chain planner will I be if I can put some AI into my consumption and production? And how much better of a forecast can I get? One of the things I always struggled with as a buyer is getting a forecast for my sales guys. Right? What do you want to sell? Well, put some tools to it. Let me take AI. Let me take some kind of analytics and look at my historical rate. Is it seasonal? How can I be a better planner, a better forecast? How can I optimize my warehouse using robotics and AI in a warehouse? Can I pick better? Can I reduce my order inaccuracies? Can I make it safer? Can I operate lights out with robots and have a lot more staging, not taking humans out of it, but making humans better at their jobs? The reality is we have fewer people in the workforce for whatever reason. And so allowing them to do their jobs better through technology. One of the biggest complaints on the strike for the port workers was automation and coming of that kind of technology. And I understand that's scary. Instead of embracing that, is to say, hey, how can this make my job easier, right? These guys work really hard, right? So can automation make their job easier? Not take their job, but make it easier. Make it more efficient, right? How much quicker could we unload a container ship if there's an algorithm telling you, okay, or do it in this order and put these trucks in, and you have a barcode or a QR code on those containers and it knows what's in it and where it's going. And could you leverage that technology? And so I think there's some pretty exciting stuff out there. I think from the military perspective, AI, you're gonna have drones, you're gonna have cybersecurity. Obviously, there's going to be threats, and there's going to be ways that we're going to have to account for security, keeping our data safe. As we get more and more data out on the cloud and more information out there, and so I think that's a whole new industry or an expansion of an existing industry that DoD's really acted in the cybersecurity world. I think that's going to spill over more into the non-traditional commercial side of it. Right, not just banks and DoD, but what's a warehouse operation going to do? What's a natural gas pipeline going to do? What's a power plant going to do? So having that, those layers of technology on there, it's going to help you do your jobs better. That kind of a little bit of a rambling answer, but I see kind of 4 or 5 things in technology that are going to be, I think, game changing for supply chain.
Yeah, without question, and I think there's a lot of resistance and fatigue around the onslaught of AI, if you will, and really it's making its way into every industry across the board. And I think that resistance slowly but surely is being alleviated once, the more of the traditionalists start to understand the benefits and how it can affect an industry like supply chain. There's so much data in supply chain. There's insights, billion-dollar insights in your data that isn't being utilized. And AI is a tool that is, applicable to every industry in one way or another, and can help pull those insights out. Like you said, how can we unload, can we use AI to unload a ship faster by 34%, which equates to how many dollars in cost saved if we can maximize efficiency using data we have but aren't utilizing because we don't know how to. And I think once those benefits start to become more clear, the resistance will go away, and we'll be maximizing efficiency across the board, whether you're in the military, supply chain, or a janitorial company. It'll be, a productivity party, if you will.
Yeah, I would love to see us do it in the airline industry, right? Southwest is going away from their most efficient model of loading and unloading planes. I would love to see Delta or Americans do some analytics and say, hey, we're going to board our planes from the back to the front. Let's get the first class guys a little extra time instead of putting them on first. How could you do that? How could you turn a plane quicker? How could you how can you work within the technology to make everybody's lives better? I get the resistance with all these AI that can make an actor say something that they didn't say, or make a politician say something they didn't say. But let's flip that. Let's use that.
Yeah. I don't think anyone wants that either. The nonsense, the pretenders and the bad actors utilizing AI for malicious intent, when it comes to politics or, gossip and Hollywood crap, you name it. But yeah, no, in terms of understanding data and analytics, I mean, like I said, the insights are in the data, but sometimes, a lot of companies I talk to, they're living in Excel still. And there's valuable insights that are in there that they're not able to access just because they don't have the technology and they don't know how to.
Like our SharePoint sites are so disjointed, and how much data is on there that you just can't find.
Yeah, or using multiple softwares that aren't talking to each other, for example, and connecting everything into a single interface, perhaps. And I think that's the direction we're going, and yeah, AI may have a bad rep in some cases across some people, like you said. I mean, being able to create a video of, say, Donald Trump, for example, saying this or that. I mean, yeah, unfortunately that technology exists, but when you get to the really foundation as to the power that it will have and the impact it'll have for the good in terms of how we can utilize it for, business in general in the future. The sky's really the limit, and looking forward to seeing how it affects your industry as well as everyone else. So
100%. I'm kind of, so I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm a little bit of kind of feet in both worlds, right? Analog and some embracing some technology. And I'm a late adopter on AI, but I'm getting there for sure.
Fantastic, Pat. Well, hey, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining the Results Loading podcast today. Ton of really great insights here, especially in supply chain and people management, everything in between. Good luck to you, and thanks again. Maybe we'll have you back on here in about a year and see how we're feeling about AI and where the world is at that point. And we can compare and contrast a little bit. And yeah, man, looking forward to it. Thanks again, and good luck to you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. It's been great. Yeah, looking forward to seeing this published and seeing what you guys keep doing. And yeah, let's do it again.
You got it. Thanks again, Pat.